And welcome. This is the World War One stream. We are now into January 1915. It's still the first year of the war, technically, but it is what it is, right?
Pretty much, yeah. But it is the start of the war. It is the beginning and the start of it's the first parts of the war. The casualties, however, are beginning, are continuously mounting, and the Western theater is completely, locked into basically just shelling one another, small little actions. What I mean by that is they're just more or less individual small unit actions where either side does a quick spoiling attack and a trench raid from one end to the other. Right? They're not doing much of anything of substance. There's no in the West. There's no major offensive starting. All right. On the East, you have the offensive of the Turks against the Russians. All right, when they announced their declaration has petered out now and is basically coming to an end where they're losing. So that's finishing up, right? Now, one thing that does happen, and this is more of a diplomatic thing, but it does happen in January, is Japan issues an ultimatum, a 21 demand ultimatum to China. All right. Basically pressing its claims in China, demanding territorial concessions and so forth. Right, this is called the 21 demands. And China initially agrees to all but the last group of them. And in the last group, they say they'll work those out later. And in a few months, in May, they're going to accept completely the terms that the Japanese have issued to them. And it basically amounts to total capitulation by Imperial China to the territorial demands, especially in Manchuria, of the Japanese. So Japan has made an aggressive move, but they've done it not militarily per se. They've done it more along the lines of diplomatic manner.
No, and that's something that's not really mentioned very often when discussing World War One at all.
Well, that's because people say that it's a world war, and they forget there was an aspect of the world that was all around the world, that these things are taking place. Yes, all these agents are being going around the world, but there's very little action that they see in the Pacific. It does happen, all right. It's sporadic, but it's not. It's not the heavy fighting that you see coming in World War II. But in World War I, these things, there are actions, there are military conflicts that are happening around the world. The other aspect is where warfare, people don't think about warfare taking place because it didn't so much in World War II. All right, is on the continent of Africa. You have the German forces actually pressing, all right, and fighting directly with the colonial forces of the British and the colonial forces of the French, trying to take territory back and forth. Now, eventually that's going to peter out simply from the fact of, supply capabilities. But during this time frame, you do have active combat in the deep African Congo, in the deep African, continent. Not just as we think about it in the northern group, right, with the Arabs, but deeper in the Congo and in not just Libya in those areas, but much deeper. You're into the continent of Africa, where you have German forces attempting basically to move south and take out. They're looking to try and take South Africa. Now, of course, it fails, but that is an attempt that they're trying to push. That is something they're trying to press.
Yeah, no, and as we were talking a little bit earlier, on Discord, you do have the beginning of the chemical weapons, right?
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I've got from the start of one of the battles. We'll talk about that. But before that happens, you have one more thing happening, and that is the Turks are beginning their new offensive in the Sinai. and their grand scheme is they're going to attack Egypt. Egypt is now a colony, thanks to the French, the battles between France and Germany. France and England. England is now under the supremacy of the British at this point, and they're going to attack Egypt. They're going to try to reconquer it.
It's actually at this point too, where the large majority of the Anzacs, the Australians and New Zealanders, are actually in Cairo at the moment, training up for the impending Ardennes offensive. Not Ardennes, sorry, the Dardanelles.
They did that. That is true as well. It is in this month. This is the month that they decided to do that. They were going to do a Dardanelles offensive. All right. Now they haven't kicked it off yet. Gallipoli hasn't been kicked off yet, because even though they've selected that they're going to do something in this, plans are going to change within the British government a lot of times before they actually kick off the campaign.
But at this present moment, we're in Cairo for a 4.5 month retraining and fucking climatization process.
Which 4 months is probably what you need for being in the desert if you're going to get used to it.
Oh,
I'll
yeah.
be honest with you. You're not going to want to go into a desert environment after just 2 weeks and then go, you know what, I'm going to go ahead and fight in this, especially in the kind of warfare that you're going to end up in with just horrible heat and so forth.
Well, it is a lot different. I mean, like, a lot of people know Australia has deserts, right? So you're thinking, okay, you got Australian guys from the outback, we're giving them horses, we're sending off to a desert. What's the difference? Well, okay, yeah, you can find water in the Australian desert. Not so much in Egypt. You can keep your horses watered and fed in the desert in Australia. Not so much in Egypt. A big learning curve for us.
Oh yeah, and that's a major thing. So let me the first thing is, though, before we get to any of that, let's talk about this. This is the Battle of the Dogger Banks. This is a naval action, all right, where Beatty basically makes his name well known to the British people. All right, he is basically the British commander in this. Now, what has happened is, of course, the German fleet being bottled up, they're trying to do raids on the coast of England, all right? But the British are listening in. They know that this raid is coming, right? They've decoded the German plans, right? And they're basically sailing there, as you can see from the number of squadrons that they had waiting for them, with far more ships, right? So you had the Sedets, the Molka, the Fligler, and the Blucher, right? Basically, the core of the German cruiser detachments, and they are set upon by the battle cruisers Indomitable, New Zealand, Princess Royal, Tiger, and Lion, all right, and also the light cruisers from Northampton, Binghamton, Southampton, all right, and a third battle cruiser squadron that actually doesn't get into the battle, but is there, okay. Once the Germans see that the British fleet, all right, especially the types of ships they are, they immediately do a U-turn and start to run for home. Now, the British, of course, give chase and begin firing. And you can look at this map right here. You can see where the British begin their firing from long distance, all right, hitting the back of the Germans. Now, the slowest ship that the Germans had was the Blucher. The Blucher is an old cruiser, and it is obviously the slowest ship, at which point the concentration fire gets to the point where it starts to fall out of line. Once it falls out of line, the British concentrate all of their fire on it. Now, the problem from that perspective is, the Blucher gets sunk, and you see that it's sunk here.
Right, but here. Now you're letting everyone else run away.
Exactly. While they sink the Blucher, everybody else got away. And in the battle where they're fighting back and forth, and they're starting to shoot back and forth, the British actually, while they do sink the Blucher, and from that standpoint, you know, they come off without any ships of the British being sunk. The Lion, which is the flagship of the British in this engagement, that what's his name? Oh, I just said his name.
Beatty.
Beatty, yes, Beatty is on, right? Takes a pounding to the point where it's laid up for like 4 to 5 months, completely out of action, trying to repair the damage that's been done to it. It's not significant, but there's two things to note about this battle. One is that the British are doing an excellent job and are well aware of any and all movements by the Germans. All right, and the Germans are surprised at this. The Germans are very surprised that that from this attack. Okay, you would think that they would learn, the Germans would learn, but they never do. All right. The other aspect of this is that they get the idea that the battle cruisers, all right, like the Lion, Indomitable, New Zealand, and Tiger, right, that they're involved. That yeah, they can be hurt, but they work the way they were intended. Okay, so they're very, for lack of a better term, cocky about the capabilities of these ships. They did what they were supposed to do. All right, but the Germans didn't come out with the whole high seas fleet. This was just a cruiser engagement for more than anything else. So that's enough of that. Do you have any questions about this, Mad Dog, or any comments to make, rather?
Well, no. It kind of seems like it was really the naval engagement was more of a running engagement, right? They didn't necessarily. I think they sank 2 or 3 German vessels.
They only sank one. They only sank the Blucher.
Oh, okay. Yeah, a majority of them made it back to port, but then they were bottlenecked for the entire rest of the war.
Well, they're coming out again. This is 1915. They're going to come out again. The Battle of Jutland is going to take place. Okay. Now, we were discussing how the Dardanelles campaign, all right, it has been approved. This is, of course, the First Sea Lord Winston Churchill's big gambit to try and break the stalemate early in the war. It's been approved. They're going to do something. They just haven't come back and said exactly what it is. Because, like I said, the plans of how they're going to do it is going to change severely, which is going to lead to Gallipoli. But
because you also got to remember too that right at the beginning, Winston Churchill was thinking really radically weird, stupid shit. Like he was going to sail a battleship group through the Dardanelles up the back part of the fucking the Dardanelles Straits. That's like basically a choke point. It's only like about fucking 10 k's wide at the widest, and it's lined with fucking guns.
Yeah, at its widest, it's 10K. I think at its narrowest, it's like a mile.
Yeah, and it is lined with guns. You would not get 5 fucking feet with any battleship, fucking let alone a battle group. So that was the kind of wacky shit they were thinking right at the beginning.
Well, and they believed they could force the issue. The other thing that's quite interesting at this point is the Germans have basically turned over 2 fairly modern, warships to the Turks. The Turks do have 2 fairly modern battleships there. Well, I should just call them battleships. They're cruisers. All right. So they're not completely unarmed from a naval engagement. Now, they're not going to take on a British battleship, let's be honest. All right. But they do represent a threat that if they ever got out, they could create problems for shipping. And that was always the issue, is that a single commerce raider, if it catches merchant ships without a battleship screen, they could take it out. There are no carriers at this point. All right. And in this area of the war, there's really not much anything else. The Germans, from an air perspective, have begun using the Zeppelins, and they are now starting to raid at night, all right, across the channel, all right, and on bombing campaigns from Zeppelins, all right. Of course, this isn't very effective, but I mean, but they do exist. The air war is ramping up.
The Zeppelin campaign was more a terror raid kind of situation more than a strategic thing.
Well, it was designed for 2 purposes. It was designed to see whether or not it could force the British fleet, all right, further away to give the high seas fleet a little bit more room, which that portion of it absolutely failed. And the other thing was to try and get the British to send more ships down there, if for no other reason than to provide cover. Once again, relieving at least part of the pressure points to try and get the British to cover a larger area than what the number of ships they had available could do. But it was, from that perspective, it was like you said, though, it wasn't very effective, and so it wasn't. I mean, it did irritate the population. Didn't do much else than that. Meanwhile, the Germans are building up for an offensive, which is going to kick off next month. Right, it's going to kick off in February, but they're building for an offensive. Now, if you take a look, let's go back to the Sinai campaign, and I think it's this. I'm trying to find the map that I pulled up for it. Here it is. The Ottomans begin their march into the Sinai, and this is the Sinai campaign. All right, you see that they're kicking off along a well-established roads here, well-established routes to go into it. And they begin this campaign where they're going to try and come on over. They're going to try and seize the Suez Canal. All right. Now this is important because this is going to force the British to actually react. When they go through the Sinai and they get to this point to attack the Suez Canal, as the British begin to see what the plan is, because seizing the Suez Canal, all right, makes their job of maintaining order throughout the empire that much more difficult. Okay, so they begin the campaign. As you see, they march more or less unopposed. All right, the Arab forces at this point are not really contesting them in any way, shape, or form. They're allowing the Turks basically to march all the way into this region right here. All right, throughout the month of January. Right, and this is where they end up. And
why are they
the British say, okay.
Why are they allowing them freedom of movement like that, though?
Well, part of it's because of logistically they have the advantage over everybody. They can move. The British focus wasn't anywhere in Egypt. Egypt was always a sidelight. The loss of the Suez Canal will be a pain in the ass, but the British, to be honest, are not really that concerned about it from the perspective of, is it really threatening their empire? It does make connections to their empire more difficult, but they're not really considering it a major threat. And to be honest, they've got a very low opinion of the Turkish army. They believe that when the Turks get to a point where they're ready to take them on, they will take them on. And what they're trying to do at this point is they're trying to do what you see in Lawrence of Arabia. They're trying to raise the Arabs to go deal with it so that they don't have to actually put British forces into this. You got to remember, their focus is on the big boys, their big problems, right? Dealing with the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans, and also keeping Russia in the war. Now, Russia has beaten back the Ottoman Turks from their offensive, their most recent offensive, but the Austro-Hungarians are slowly starting to make headway, all right, toward Belfast and Serbia.
Belgrade, you mean?
Belgrade, I'm sorry. Belgrade. You're right. I said Belfast. I meant Belgrade.
Yeah.
Total different part. Yeah. No, I'm not talking about the Irish Isles.
Different little hotspot.
Which becomes a hotspot coming up.
So in other words, the British are basically expecting the Ottoman Turks to overextend their supply lines, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and what's more is the discipline of their troops and everything they're kind of ignoring. And it's during this they've begun the roundup of the Armenians that they're going to basically send down here to quote unquote fight with the British and basically leave them to die. This is the beginning. They are doing the roundup at this point of the Armenians for the Armenian genocide.
Well, remember, according to the Young Turks, that never happened. So, fake news.
Yeah, I understand. Now, the Ottomans themselves are in turmoil politically as well. All right, the Sultan, people are questioning the regime and the whole business of the Ottomans. So that's all taking place as well. There's a lot of political maneuvering going on within the Turkish Empire. But overall, it hasn't gotten to the point where it's beginning to crumble yet. But grumblings have begun. But this is not a bad movement from a military perspective. You start here, you run along this road line here, but it shows you how important these logistical road lines are more than anything else. All right. You also see they leave from this point. Now, this point is very important, and you'll see it again later. And the reason is this is a railroad line. This is really one of the areas you can easily move troops to from a supply point and then move on through as you go through for supplies. Right, and you will see that become a point for the Arabs to conquer and put an end to it later on. El Megra.
So another interesting thing about this particular area here is that these main roads and all this kind of stuff, it basically really hasn't changed almost in a couple of 100 years. These roads have seen quite a few wars. Basically, every war that's happened in that part of that neck of the woods since the industrial age has focused on those roads. All the Israeli wars in that area, like all the the Ottomans and all this kind of everything. And the major reason for that is because all these blank spots, that gigantic sort of big blank triangle there at the sort of the right side of the screen, right center. Most of that land is untenable. You can't get vehicles across it. It's impassable by most, even like ground troops in a lot of occasions, because of just the trying to supply people over that kind of an area.
You're talking about this right here?
Yep. Yeah, and that has actually been used as a tactical strong point for fucking almost 100 years, that specific area, because of the terrain.
I think I would go further than that, Farty, and I would say that a lot of those roads are built by the Romans. They go back 2,500 years, right?
Yeah, but the reason why they are actually in these specific spots is because pretty much everywhere else you can't get vehicles across it anyways, because the terrain's not suitable for like traversing and shit. So that's really realistically the only routes of travel you've got in those areas, especially for major forces and all this kind of stuff.
Well, and you're looking at just desert land, right?
Yeah,
so
This is the Sinai. The thing to remember is what you're looking at here is an expanded version of the Sinai. And I'll give you another example that's going to become important here. Right down here, see it? This is Aqaba. This is the port city of Aqaba. And this is where the British are going to supply Lawrence of Arabia's troops, is through this port city of Aqaba right here.
Well, yeah, and you could you can just back off and condense your forces and make them traverse this large desert and overextend themselves.
Right.
You could, but you'd be wasting troops. You'd be getting any kind of vehicle you got completely bogged and stuck. You'd be wasting resources trying to keep them moving, and then you'd be finding it awfully hard to keep your men fed and watered. And then when you get out into the middle parts of that area, you're going to have people dying of exhaustion and heat stroke and all this kind of stuff. And you just get bogged down. You stay away from it. It's flat out.
Yeah, the thing to remember, this is World War I. You walk from point A to point B. That is the normal movement for infantry troops, is you're going to march through this shit. Okay? There's not cars to jump on. There's not a lot of cars that you're going to, where it's motorized and you jump onto a car and you drive for 15 miles and then you hop back off and then maybe you march a mile or two. No, you're marching everywhere.
Yeah.
All right. If you can't get there by rail, right, which is this line right here, if you can't get there by rail, guess what? It's Shoe Leather Express.
Yeah, and all your heavy shits on horseback, maybe, if you're lucky, camels. If you're lucky.
You're pulling artillery. That's true. You're not. I mean, you're basically pushing it the old-fashioned way. It's on big road big wheels that you drag behind you. All right, and yes, it's being dragged by camels or horses. It's being transported by camels or horses. Now, eventually, in the northern section of this, you're going to see the British are basically the the active British forces will use the northern route, all right, and they'll leave the southern aspect of this to the Arabs and the Arab armies as they're raising, the revolt in Saudi Arabia proper, all right. But that is just at the beginnings of this. That hasn't quite happened quite yet, all right. They haven't gotten the forces quite there yet. So, and then.
Okay. Well, that's the Eastern Front, where you have the Turks finally pushing in. The Western Front is still in a stalemate, right?
The Western Front is in a stalemate. After the first Battle of Champagne, the French are licking their wounds, and basically Joffre is preparing for the next great offensive in the campaign. All right, in the Champagne region, they're building up their forces. They're resupplying them. Like I said, what's happening there is trench warfare at its worst, where they're just sitting in trenches. They snipe across there. Hundreds of people are dying a day. All right. They just throw artillery rounds back and forth at one another. But overall, you're just sitting on the front waiting to see the enemy. At night, you have trench raids where, 15 or 20 of your, platoons run out into the no man's land, through no man's land, sneak up on the enemy, grab a couple of prisoners that are on guard duty, right, and run back to the other trench. Both sides are doing this. And so, both sides are whittling away at one another, but these men are suffering now, staying in these trenches, and now you're starting to see the first cases of what will become known as trench foot, especially in the Wipers region, or the Yeeps region, whatever. All right, where they're basically, in a bog. All right, that area is basically a bog. There's no other way to describe it. All right, so it's constant wet. The trenches are it's hard to get out of your feet dry long enough to actually recover from what will become as trench foot, where it's just a debilitating disease. That takes a long time to cure, so that you get these diseases, these casualties from that. And then, of course, what you have is, in certain areas, is you have massive shelling going on. That the troops are in an area, all of a sudden, an artillery barrage will begin for 15 or 20 minutes, right, into an area. If it's on target, you see your friends and your mates killed. And if it's not on target, you just deal with the explosions as they throw dirt around in front of you. Ever-present death, ever-present stench, which is another thing that's beginning to happen. Is the people that have died, bodies that are in no man's land.
Oh yeah, they can't retrieve them. So they're literally getting pounded into the dirt and mincemeat. Like all the artillery barrages, they're just getting churned up. That's like that's a part of the reason why a lot of them are missing in action, never found, because they literally were turned into atoms. Well, and the ones that aren't are decomposing like fuck and already exploded, liquefying and stuff.
Unfortunately, it's a slow decomposition that lasts for months because of the weather and everything. This is January, and it's not cold enough to freeze, but it's not hot enough to where after a couple days it desiccates the corpse. So the corpses just rot slowly.
And as a lot of these corpses start sort of oozing into the water table, you start getting not diseases but viruses and shit like that, like bloody dysentery and all that kind of shit, because the blokes are basically the live ones that have to be interacting with this water table that's got so much fucking decomp fucking oozing down into it. Eventually it's going to start breeding all this shitty bacteria and all that kind of stuff.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's just, and they're dealing with this day after day. It looks like we lost Mad Dodge for a second. You're dealing with this day after day.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that a lot of people don't understand too. Is that they talk about the ones that get shot and blown up and all this kind of stuff, but there was a huge amount of people that died just from fucking disease alone.
Yep. I mean, it's truly it's truly horrific what's happening, what's going through this. It truly is. And let me pull up a map of France to show people what's getting ready. This is an old map of what the intentions were, but it gives you an idea of what you're dealing with here. That's not what I wanted. Hold on a second here. Here we are. And this is a map of where you're at. You have yips right here. All right. You're going to see where these areas are going to come through. This is going to become a bulge that's going to get pushed back from the German offensive. Right along here is the Champlain region. All right, that you're getting ready to see a major battle take place again. Welcome back, Mad Dodge. I don't know if you guys how well you can see this. If you want, I'll try and zoom it out a little bit. This might be a little bit easier to see. All right, this is the Champlain region. That once again they're going to start the battle over again. All right, they're getting ready for the French are getting ready for a major offensive through here. All right, this is the current this route line right here is basically the stabilized battle line, and you're going to see the offensive try to take place, and of course we'll talk about that next month when they begin the offensive. All right, and the mass slaughter begins. All right, as they're moving armies after armies. And now, I think that this is the French, or I mean the Russian area, where the Germans are getting ready for their grand offensive. Now, the Russians have recovered from their disaster at Tannenberg, right? And they're licking their wounds, waiting for old man winter to give them the advantage, and so they're getting ready to start the next offensive. Okay, the Germans, however, are not about to let this go by. All right, and what they're doing right now is they're preparing a counterattack here. Right, and this is going to be just a small counterattack in this region. Right, but what it does do is, first of all, the counterattack is successful and they're able to push the Russians back. But more than anything else, they use for the first time chemical weapons. All right, and they use 18,000 chemical shells. All right, in this attack. Now, this is not nerve gas. This is not mustard gas. This is not even chlorine gas. What they're firing, all right, is a kind of a aerosol kind of mixture for like CS or tear gas, a type of tear gas environment. Okay, it does the offensive is the offensive works, right? But it's so cold that the actual tear gas rounds, the Russians didn't even realize in most cases that they were even being fired at them. Because it basically is so cold that the droplets are freezing as soon as they hit the air, and are for all intents and purposes non-effective. All right. Now, how do they fire these rounds? Well, they fire these artillery shells, they pop, but they're also intermixing these artillery shells with regular artillery. Right. So you have soft pops where they're trying to spread the gas, but then you have, of course, the heavy explosions that are taking place. All right, as well. So you have big shells going off with these little shells. The Russians are basically pushed back into the situation, which allows them to take Warsaw. All right, the Germans to take Warsaw away from them. All right, now this is going to be important because the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians are not just working on this from the standpoint of battlefield environments. They are also engaging in diplomacy. And